Hello, everyone. My name is Carolyn Vellenga Berman, and I am delighted to welcome you all to Emma at 200, Fiction, Fashion, Feminism, a symposium to commemorate the 200th anniversary of the publication of Jane Austen's Emma. Published... Oh, good, I've done all I need to. Published in 3 volumes in 1815, Emma marked its anonymous author's success as it was produced by a distinguished imprint with a dedication to the Prince Regent at his request. And it was favorably reviewed by Sir Walter Scott, who cited the peculiar tact with which the author presents characters that the readers cannot fail to recognize, and the ways in which her subjects are finished up to nature and with a precision which delights readers. Austen's peculiar tact has lured readers for 2 centuries with interpretive riddles concerning Austen's relation to radical feminism, among other things. Austen's finishing and precision have also continued to delight readers to this day. As D.A. Miller writes in Jane Austen or The Secret of Style in 2003, all of us who read Austen early, say at 11 or 12, the age when she began writing, were lost to the siren lure of her voice. Such thrillingly inhuman utterance was not stylish, it was style itself. Speaking of Emma, Austen announced that I'm going to take a heroine whom no one but myself will much like, unquote. Yet over the course of 2 centuries, Emma and its author have survived the transition from books as luxury goods to cheap reprints and finally cheap or even free downloads, as in a Kindled with many shared underlinings. And its reinvention as luxury good again in beautifully crafted new editions, while spawning film, theatrical, and novelistic adaptations from Clueless, which is based on Emma, and is now coming to Broadway, to Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, which is now arriving in movie theaters, I believe. Austen's power shows no sign of waning today. On the contrary, she is slated to appear on the British 10-pound banknote this year, replacing Charles Darwin. So much for evolution. As the result of a feminist social media campaign, which prompted a notable anti-feminist social media backlash, Austen's fiction and her feminism are still contested. Why is Austen's Emma still in fashion after 200 years? And how do we read the novel now? With my colleagues, Elaine Savory and Elizabeth Kendall, I have taken the opportunity to bring together colleagues from literary studies at Eugene Lang College, fashion studies at Parsons, and gender studies across the New School, along with a number of very distinguished guests to address this question. First, we will consider the fashions of fiction by looking at Emma's book covers and illustrations across the years with Juliette Wells, who is the editor of a gorgeous new Penguin annotated edition, and we are very grateful for their permission to reproduce the book cover on our program. So thank you to Penguin. Next, we will consider what Austen does with the marriage plot in Emma, as the marriage plot in Austen relates to both money and romance, and how we can rethink this marriage plot from new perspectives today. In the afternoon, we will consider the fashions of feminism, starting with Virginia Woolf's response to Austen in the early 20th century, followed by a panel on Austen's feminist style with varied approaches to gender studies, literary, historical, and theoretical, perhaps. The role of fashion itself in Austen's fiction will be a theme throughout our symposium, but we take up fashions in Austen's time and our own in a final panel devoted to fashion, craft, and social media, with a wide-ranging conversation about fashion history, creative writing, literary scholarship, and social media. And we will conclude the day with a screening of the film adaptation Clueless, now celebrating its 20th anniversary, and it will be introduced by Jen Chaney, the author of As If, a new oral history of Clueless. There will be time for questions at the end of every individual talk and every panel, so be prepared. And we have a mic, which I think we'll pull out You can line up behind the mic when requested. I would note that the event is being live streamed. There's a overflow room in case you lose your seat. You might want to hold on to your seats. And that it will be archived on YouTube as well. Portions of it will be archived. There is a table where books will be for sale, including Emma in the new edition and many other books by speakers who are speaking today, between 11 and 4:30 p.m. So be sure to check out the book table. And I would like to thank Jane McNamara, our Assistant Dean for Strategic Initiatives, for supporting this event, as well as Jennifer Regal, James Mallinson, and Hillary Ilke for their really extraordinary work in putting the event together. I'd also like to thank Lauren, Zora, and other student volunteers from my classes and Elaine Savory's classes. And I hope to hear from our students later on during the question and answer as well. Many thanks to our New School co-sponsors, and we are extremely pleased to join forces with the Jane Austen Society of North America, New York chapter today. And I'm also particularly grateful to the New York Council for the Humanities, which has generously sponsored our program. Finally, thanks most of all to Stephanie Browner, the Dean of Eugene Lang College, for hosting the event. And we're honored that she is here to say a few words.
Good morning and welcome to Eugene Lang College, which is the liberal arts college within the New School, and it's full of amazing faculty, talented writers, scholars, scientists, artists, like Carolyn and her colleagues who have made this event possible. It is a very young college, 30 years old, with a remarkably interdisciplinary and nimble curriculum where faculty teach what they study and students study what they're interested in, and the result is really quite remarkable. It is an honor to be a part of this college. Welcome to the New School, a location in New York City where you get some of the best public programming, from Emma to Edward Snowden, piped in via Skype talking with Laura Poitras last fall about her movie, Citizen4, to week-long residencies with Bell Hooks, to a few years ago when Carolyn Berman did a great session on Lolita at 50. We do birthdays around here. And lots of other great programming here at the New School. Thanks to all my colleagues across the New School who have supported this. Thanks especially to the Eugene Lang faculty and to Carolyn for making this possible. I hope you enjoy your time here, and welcome.
Good morning. I'm Gina Luria Walker, and I'm delighted to introduce Juliette Wells, who is Associate Professor and Chair of English at Goucher College in Baltimore, Maryland, which is home of the distinguished Henry G. and Alberta H. Burke Jane Austen Collection and the Emma in America Digital Humanities Project. For Penguin Classics, Juliette created a reader-friendly 200th anniversary annotated edition of Jane Austen's Emma, published in September 2015. She has written extensively on Austen's novels and their afterlives, most notably in Everybody's Jane, Austen in the Popular Imagination, 2011, the first comprehensive account of Austen's importance to readers today, which of course we are testimony to. Juliette co-edited The Brontes in the Arts, 2008, and has published on articles on topics ranging from chick lit to Oprah's Book Club. She is on the board of the Jane Austen Society of North America and on the editorial board of the Society's journal Persuasions. And in May, I heard Juliette give a wonderful paper at the Bryn Mawr Conference on Women's History in the Digital World. And when Carolyn first approached me about participating in today's event, I said, let's see if Juliette can join us. So take it away, Juliette.
Thanks so much, Gina, for that kind introduction. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for coming this morning. It is a very special pleasure for me to recognize so many faces from the New York region of the Jane Austen Society of North America, JASNA. I began my teaching career at Manhattanville College in Westchester County, and the New York region of JASNA were a steady source of support and encouragement for me in those early years as I established myself in Austen studies, and I could not be more pleased to be coming back from Baltimore to share some of my recent exploration in Emma and book history. Today, I'll be approaching our 3 alliterative topics from an unusual vantage point. As my title indicates, I'm focusing on the fashions not of human dress, but of the presentation of books. We all know what books look like today. Some of them have beautiful covers, like this one by the artist Daru Shin for the New Penguin Classics, which makes such a splendid touchstone image for our whole symposium. But most of us know much less about how Austen's novels, historically, appeared to their first and subsequent owners, and how those appearances changed as a result of choices made by those owners. Here, for example, are images of a copy of the first American edition of Emma, published in Philadelphia in 1816, and now held at the Goucher College Library. Unless you are a rare books conservator, a collector, or other specialist, it's likely that these images don't say very much to you. They certainly wouldn't have said much to me a few years ago before I began to turn my attention as a researcher away from present-day popular culture and towards the history of books and reading. The first part of my talk this morning is designed to help all of us see and understand more when we look at a historic copy of an edition of an Austen novel. I'll begin by explaining some concepts that help us appreciate all the original editions of Austen's novels, and then I'll move to some special consideration of the first American edition of Emma. The final portion of my talk returns to more familiar ground, illustrations and cover images in which we can think about historical representations of fashion, dress for Emma the heroine, in other words, as well as for Emma the novel. Woven throughout, if you'll forgive the pun, will be a few reflections about how feminism illuminates our view of the dress of the book, as well as our understanding of the relationship between books as material objects and their readers. My inspiration for approaching Emma and fashion in this way comes from 2 quotations, one of which I've lived with for a while, and one of which was brought to my attention last summer at the conference of the Society for the History of Authorship, Reading, and Publishing, which has the wonderful acronym SHARP. Let me start with that one from SHARP, because it's pithier and so fundamental. A book's binding is its dress and its mirror. And this was attributed by a SHARP speaker to a lecture given by the distinguished book historian Miriam Foote. I think this is a genius formulation because it helps even those of us who are novices to book history to grasp the essential truth about books as physical objects during the lifetime of Jane Austen. As most all of us know very well, Jane Austen, who was born in 1775 and died in 1817, lived during the end of what book historians call the hand press period. All the books she read and knew, as well as all of those she published, were printed on human-operated presses. Machine presses existed during her adulthood, but didn't dominate until closer to the middle of the 19th century. Indeed, the books of Jane Austen's lifetime were entirely handmade objects. Paper was made by hand by skilled artisans in a demanding process, with the result that paper was extremely expensive. In fact, for any book in this era, the cost of the paper was the single greatest cost in the production process. With paper, too, we come to our first important point of contact between books and dress. Paper in Jane Austen's lifetime was made from cotton and linen rags. The more worn the rags, the more useful for paper making. So chemises and undergarments, soft from use, were especially valued for this purpose. Literally, the pages of a first edition of one of Austen's novels might have had their origins in an intimate garment. Type, too, was set by hand by compositors. That's the process you see in this 18th century engraving, which shows some of the operations in a printing workshop. A typesetter's role in shaping the appearance of a printed book went well beyond what we might imagine. Converting a handwritten manuscript into regular print could and often did involve regularizing an author's spelling, punctuation, and paragraph breaks. Certainly, that would have been the case for Jane Austen's prose. Here, borrowed from just up the road at the Morgan Library, we see a manuscript page from Austen's unfinished novel, The Watsons. And you can see if you were converting that into print, you probably wouldn't leave it just formatted as Austen did in her own handwriting. We know from Austen's letters during the production process of the first English edition of Emma that she fielded queries from compositors regarding her own spelling, as in this letter she wrote to her sister Cassandra on November 26, 1815. "The printers continue to supply me very well. I'm advanced in volume 3 to my era route, upon which peculiar style of spelling there is a modest query in the margin." But the appearance of a finished book in Jane Austen's lifetime was not due only, or perhaps even primarily, to the labor performed in the printing workshop. As two great American book historians, James N. Green and Peter Stallybrass, have memorably summed up, printers print sheets, but books are made by binders. In a first edition of any Austen novel, as with any book of the period, the arrangement of words on each page, what you see on your left, is the work of the printer. How the pages are gathered together, sewn, bound, and presented in a book, what you see on the right, is the work of the binder. The word sewn alerts us to another important commonality between books and clothing at this time. Stitches with needle and thread brought groups of pages together to create the sturdy three-dimensional structure of a book, just as stitches brought pieces of fabric together to create the three-dimensional structure of a dress or a coat. As you can see in this slide, which shows a volume of one of the surviving copies of the first American edition of Emma, stitching could also be done at home to reinforce a book whose structure had begun to deteriorate, much as you could repair a garment. And if you're wondering whether women ever had a role in the binding trade, the answer is yes, they did, but we do not know a whole lot about that work in most cases. As a side note, we know that Jane Austen herself enjoyed sewing and was very good at it. Here are pictures of the so-called quilt. Specialists say it's actually a coverlet, not a quilt, but it's known as the Austen quilt, that she created with her mother and her sister Cassandra during the early 1810s, which is to say, during her most productive period as a writer. She was also choosing to spend time sewing with her family members. To our knowledge, Jane Austen never tried her hand at binding a book. The parallel between books and dress deepens when we consider how volumes of a novel like one of Austen's were originally presented for sale. Typically, such a book was offered in very basic binding, known as boards. This is the state you see on the left, essentially thin wooden or cardboard covers in a slip cover of paper. The edges of the printer's sheets are still uncut, and those edges may, to our eyes, look sloppy. To us, these volumes look undressed. They're in their shift. Amazing to think that, even so, these were very expensive objects to buy. Carolyn called them luxury goods, and that's absolutely true. The first English edition of Emma, a 3-volume set, sold in boards for a guinea, £1 plus a shilling. Historical price conversions are very tricky. But just to give us a really rough equivalent, we could say that to buy this Emma in original boards would have cost about $100 in today's money. Not an impulse purchase for sure. Even owning a book in this unfinished looking state indicated that you were a person of means. And today, books in their original boards, surviving copies of which are quite rare, are worth a very great deal to book collectors. In other words, the humble appearance of a book in boards today entirely belies its value. If the price of a book in boards didn't clean you out, you could choose to have the volumes rebound in your choice of materials and finishes, from basic to fancy. Sheep leather, calf leather, goat leather, known as Morocco, drab colors or deep colors, plain or with gold decorations, tooling, marbling on the edges of the pages, all these were options with which you could personalize your copy. The bound Emma you see on the right is plainly but sturdily bound. If you were rich and the owner of a significant private library, you probably had a style of binding that you used on all your books so that they would look like they all belonged together. And this is a cheat. This is, of course, a picture of the Morgan Library rather than a period gentle person's library from the 18th century. But I think you can't do much better than this for a display. Given the costs in buying and binding books, it's certainly right to interpret an image like this one as a blatant display of wealth and power. What might be less obvious to the naked eye is that an owner's investment in binding also served the important function of helping to preserve the books. To come back to our slide of a moment ago, one of the reasons that books and boards didn't survive very well is that such undressed volumes are poorly protected against the rigors of reading and of life on a shelf. A leather binding need not be fancy in order to extend a book's useful life significantly. To my knowledge, there is not a further parallel here between books and dress. There isn't something that an owner could have chosen to have done to a garment that would result in its longer life. But if you know of a correction to that, I'd welcome it. Many of you know much more than I do about dress history. Certainly, we can agree that as material objects, books and garments pose similar conservation challenges to a degree. A book can be rebacked, rebound, its worn pages eked out with Japanese rice paper. Here you see the conservation record for yet another copy of the Philadelphia Emma, this one owned by the eminent Austin bibliographer David Gilson. And the typewritten notes from his book conservator, James Brockman, show all of the processes done to this copy to stabilize it and repair it. Properly cared for, in a rare books library, such volumes can remain readable for a very long time. And readable is really the point, as far as I'm concerned. I'm interested in historic copies chiefly because of what they have to tell us about their readers, as well as the experiences of reading that those copies have to offer us today. It's time for me to share the second quotation that anchors my talk today. This is one that I first encountered and mused upon when I was writing my book, Everybody's Jane. These thoughts come from the first ever bibliography, historic account of Jane Austen's editions, bibliography of Jane Austen, which was published in 1929 by Geoffrey Keynes. And just to clarify once again, a bibliography in this sense is not what we include at the end of a research paper, but instead a meticulous descriptive catalog of the historic editions of an author's work. And it was important that Jane Austen received this bibliography. It was a way of establishing her place in the literary canon. Keynes believed that the fundamental purpose of collecting rare books was to deepen one's enjoyment of reading one's favorite works. Reading Austen's novels in their first editions, he declares, affords a special kind of access to the author and her era. I'm going to go ahead and read this because I know it can be a bit hard to see on the screen, and it's so wonderful. No one who is at all sensitive to the right relations between the outsides of the early editions of so many famous books and their contents can fail to appreciate the special propriety of these issues of Jane Austen's novels. The format, typography, and binding, whether the original boards or contemporary half-calf, all seem somehow to be full of the spirit of the period, and to read any of them in this shape gives a definite addition to the reader's pleasure. To read any of these 6 novels now on the original boards is a satisfaction which only the very opulent could enjoy, even were the state of the paper joints of the covers usually not too delicate for it to be bibliophilically permissible. But anyone may be allowed to enjoy a bound copy, which at its best may be an even more delicate repast. Some of the binders of the period having been able to invest the volumes with a demure neatness, which is most comforting. Aside from the obviously somewhat strained analogy between feminine, delicate books and a female author, what comes across very clearly in this passage is Keynes's readerly rationale for collecting. Value and rarity for their own sake are not at issue here. Instead, Keynes focuses on the capacity of a historical volume to convey the spirit of the period and to contribute a definite addition to the reader's pleasure. A true lover of Jane Austen, he implies, would wish to take in her words in just the same form as was available to her original readers. To collect first editions of Austen, in other words, is to make possible for yourself a reading experience that is as close as possible to the one shared by Austen's earliest appreciators. At the risk of seeming far-fetched, we might say then that reading an Austen novel in contemporary binding, contemporary to her, not to us, gives a sense of connection comparable to that experienced by those Jane Austen fans who dress in period clothing. I want to give a shout out here to Elaine Bander, the eminent scholar who is currently the president of the Canadian section of JASNA. JASNA, an organization that brings together lovers of Austen from all across the spectrum, from scholar to devotee and back again. At the annual meeting of JASNA earlier this month, Elaine was resplendent in this aqua silk evening dress, which it turned out when I complimented her, she had stitched by hand. She told me, I wanted to see what it was like to hand stitch a Regency dress. I'll never do it again, but I wanted to see. There's something, it seems to me, quintessentially feminist about such an impulse. Does such an endeavor change our understanding of Austen's authorship, or of the relationships among the various artistic activities in which she chose to engage? Music making, sewing, writing? We will only know if we try. So far, we've been thinking about first editions of Emma, both English and American, as material objects. Let's turn our attention now to the special case of the first American edition of Emma, which is also about to celebrate its bicentennial in 2016. Emma was first published in London by John Murray in December 1815, as Carolyn mentioned, but with 1816 printed on its title page to confuse generations of students. It's important to note that Jane Austen's name is not given. She's identified only as the author of Pride and Prejudice, et cetera, et cetera. And as is well known to many of you, in 1811, the title page of Sense and Sensibility, Austen's first published novel, had identified it as by a lady, as you see on the left. In other words, while Jane Austen's gender was known to her earliest readers, her identity was not, and it remained concealed from all but her inner circle until after her death. Jane Austen's surviving letters don't tell us about her decision to represent herself this way, but her choice to remain anonymous is in keeping with social attitudes of the time regarding authorship for women, especially unmarried women. On the right, you see the title page from the first edition of Mansfield Park, identifying Austen as the author of her two previous works. Emma was the first of Jane Austen's novels to be published in America and the only one to appear in the United States during her lifetime. This first American edition, as you see from its title page, was published by M. Carey in Philadelphia, also, as I've said, in 1816. At the time of the Philadelphia Emma's publication, Matthew Carey, who lived from 1760 to 1839, was one of the foremost publishers in America. Like other American booksellers of the time, Carey sold expensive imported books, as well as titles printed in America, which were generally both produced and sold more cheaply. In fact, a catalog shows that Carey sold both his own Emma in two different price points depending on the styles of binding, as well as the London edition. Many of the titles Carey published were originally issued in England. Reprinting, which might seem to us to be piracy, was perfectly legal and common practice because no international copyright laws existed at this time. This bears stressing. Carey did not need to seek Austen's consent to reprint Emma in an American edition, and he was not doing her wrong. No evidence indicates that Austen was ever aware of the Philadelphia Emma, and she certainly did not profit from it. Would Jane Austen have cared that her novel was printed in America? I feel confident in saying yes. We know that she cared about the profits of her novels, as she headed the scrap of paper on which she kept track of some of her earnings. We know that when John Murray, the English publisher she chose for Emma, asked her to sell him her copyrights not only for Emma, but for Mansfield Park and Sense and Sensibility as well, that she refused and negotiated instead, on her own behalf, to publish Emma on commission, the same financial model she had successfully used with her previous publisher, Thomas Egerton. I'm not going to say more this morning about Austen's involvement with Murray's publication of Emma. That's a topic that I cover in more detail in the introduction to the Penguin Classics edition, if you are interested. The most significant difference between the 1816 London and Philadelphia Emmas lies in their formatting. To save money, Carey compressed the text of the novel into 2 volumes rather than the standard 3 of the English edition. The compression is evident on every page of Carey's edition. Each page is more tightly printed, as you see, with narrower margins, less space between the lines. And it makes the volumes significantly more challenging to read than the spaciously formatted pages of Murray's edition. Another cost-saving strategy of Carey's was to use a less expensive grade of paper than Murray had used. This decision made good business sense for Carey because he could not be sure how well an anonymously authored English novel would sell in the American market. The combination of cheap paper and tight binding, however, is likely responsible for how few copies survived, as well as the damaged condition of several. And I feel like I need to ask you to be prepared to cover your eyes for the next slide. Maybe that's just my reaction. These are volumes now held at Dartmouth Library that have been extremely well cared for, and they still look like this. You can see the covers bulging out from the spine at the bottom. This book was bound too tightly, and the paper, to my eye, looks like it's been chewed, and you can see that several sheets are detached from the binding and pulling loose in both of the volumes. I'm going to move away from that. Just can't look at it. I'm going to move to my favorite slide. Only 6 copies of the 1816 Philadelphia Emma are known to exist, 2 of which were unknown to Austin scholars until I began my research. You see the 6 here, brought together visually for the first time since their initial publication. I'm very proud of this slide, I have to say. It's the result of my efforts over the last few years to visit and study what I've come to think of as the surviving family members, if you will, of this long overlooked first American publication of Austin. Thanks to the choices made by the book's owners over the years, each of the 6 copies is now a unique artifact in terms of its material properties, as you can see from these photos. In the upper left is the copy we have at Goucher College, which is the fanciest, thanks to the full calf leather binding with gilt tooling on both the spine and the covers. The copy in the top middle is also in a full leather binding, sheep leather this time. This one is held at King's College at the University of Cambridge, and it's the only one of the 6 that doesn't currently live in America. On the top right is the copy owned by Winterthur Library in Delaware. This copy and Goucher's are the best preserved on the inside. In the bottom right, the somewhat battered copy held at Yale University's Beinecke Rare Books Library. You can see that on this copy there's leather on the spine, but nothing covering up, adorning the front and back covers, the boards. In the bottom middle, the copy closest to you all, at the New York Society Library. This one is in its boards and definitely the plain Jane of the group. In the bottom left, when you look at it from the cover and the spine, it's not so horrifying looking. Dartmouth College's copy at its Rauner Library. In the middle, in terms of fanciness, with leather on the spine and covers, marbled paper covering the original boards of the cover. Each of these copies bears different marks of ownership and of reading through which we can discern stories about its readers. I have many of these stories. I'll share just a few this morning. Goucher's copy of the Philadelphia Emma came to us as part of the distinguished Jane Austen collection, formed by a 1928 alumna of the college, Alberta Hersheimer Burke. As I discuss in detail in a chapter of Everybody's Jane, Alberta grew up in La Crosse, Wisconsin, married a Baltimorean named Harry Burke to his friends, and devoted her adult life to collecting rare books and other materials relating to her favorite author, Jane Austen. Goucher received the bequest of Alberta's collection following her death in 1975. While Alberta developed considerable expertise in Austen bibliography, she never wished to take a public role as an Austen scholar. She considered her collection to be for her private enjoyment, although she was generous in sharing information with others who shared her interests in Austen and book history, as well as in popular culture. Alberta was one of the most self-determined women you can imagine, and she seemed to be attracted to the same quality in Jane Austen's life and writings. Both these women, the anonymously publishing Regency novelist and the self-taught 20th century scholar, were utterly confident of the work they were doing in the world. In keeping with Alberta's desire that the first editions she loved, and story goes, she read them in the bathtub, very carefully, but she read them with pleasure. So in keeping with her desire that the first editions she loved be shared with other readers, we at Goucher have just launched a new open access digital edition of the 1816 Philadelphia Emma, which I suppose you could read in the bathtub I hadn't thought of that before, but it's a great connection. The first volume is now ready to read, and the second volume will be uploaded in December. Also included in this first phase of our website is information and images from our current exhibit about the 1816 Philadelphia Emma. The book plates in our well-traveled copy tell some of its provenance. Before Alberta Burke bought it and added her bookplate, which you see on the right, image of Winchester Cathedral in England, where Jane Austen is buried. This copy was first owned by Christiane Brown Ramsay, Countess of Dalhousie, who lived from 1786 to 1839. The American bibliophile Frank Hogan briefly owned it and added his splendid bookplate there in the lower left, following the volume's rediscovery in a Salisbury bookshop by the World War I poet Siegfried Sassoon, who chose not to put his name or bookplate on the end papers, although our copy came to us including some letters of Sassoon's talking about his ownership. We have a lot of unanswered questions about the journeys of this book. The pictures that you've now seen a couple times of this copy's binding do not do full justice to its beauty. The Countess of Dalhousie, whom we believe to have been the copy's first owner, had the volumes rebound very decoratively with gilt tooling on the spine and covers and marbling on the trimmed pages. The beauty of this copy tells us that it was cherished. I have hopes of learning more about the Countess's ownership and reading of Emma. I've just discovered that her private papers from the 1810s and 1820s are privately held in Scotland, and with luck, I'll be able to consult them next summer. Of the 6 remaining copies, this is the only one we know for certain was owned and read by a woman. Doubtless the others were, but we can confirm that with the Countess's ownership. The copy now at Winter Tour bears the signature of E.I. DuPont, who had many daughters, so it's possible that his family papers, in which I'm going to do research in the spring, contain some discussion of their reading of Emma. I'm hopeful that all these forms of investigation into early reception history will yield yet more stories of readers and reading to add to the stories that the books themselves, as material objects, have to tell. So let's change gears now and end with some visual dessert, the tour I promised you of covers and illustrations of Emma. In the era before film and television adaptations, cover images and popular illustrations served as important sources of inspiration for readers endeavoring to imagine Austen's characters. If you're familiar with Austen's writings, you know that she was pretty sparing with physical description, so illustrators have a lot to invent. And all the images that I'm showing you, don't worry, you'll get to see some of the really outrageous ones in more detail, but we've collected all the cover images of Emma's that Goucher Library owns into a gallery on our digital site. So our first cover image doesn't look particularly prepossessing, not so different from some of the 1816 copies. This is the 1833 one-volume London edition published by Richard Bentley as part of his Standard Novels series. And it matters because on the inside, we see the first illustrations ever created for Emma. This engraving, which appeared as the frontispiece to Volume 1, depicts the memorable scene early on in which Emma creates a portrait of her protege, Harriet Smith, in the belief that Mr. Elton, the eligible clergyman, is romantically interested in Harriet. Of course, as we all know, unbeknownst to Emma, Mr. Elton's attentiveness is all directed towards herself. It's noteworthy that this illustrator chose to use clothing of the 1830s, his own time period, rather than of the period of the original novel. And by the same hand, the frontispiece to the volume, or rather the image on the title page, the scene in which Mr. Knightley proposes to Emma. Again, the costumes are wrong in our eyes. We also may not envision Emma as quite this droopy-headed as she receives what is a very welcome proposal. Here, just quickly, a few more unprepossessing mass-produced bindings, case bindings, unlike the hand-bound covers of 1816. You'll have to take my word for it that these belong to copies of Emma since the publishers didn't emboss the title or author's name on the covers. This reprint Bentley continues to evoke the appearance of the earlier hand-bound books. The 1890s in both England and America saw a boom in illustrated editions, in large part due to changes in printing technology that allowed images to be reproduced cheaply, and in some cases by the dozens. I've selected just a few for today. Here we see Emma taking in Donwell Abbey, Mr. Knightley's estate, which she is visiting for the first time in several years, even though she lives just next door. The image of a woman in Regency, well, roughly Regency period dress in front of a historic house has become emblematic of Jane Austen adaptations in our own day. Hugh Thompson, one of the most charming 1890s illustrators, gives us this peek at the streets of Highbury. A quite young and hale-looking Mr. Knightley is in conversation with a chatty spinster, Miss Bates. Also from Thompson, this very affectionate portrait of Emma adjusting a cushion for her invalid father. To my eye, illustrations like Thompson's, much as I like them, reinforce readers' tendency to view Austen's fictional world as safe and cozy, a pleasant place to escape to, a criticism that has often been made in our own day of popular film and television adaptations. Hugh Thompson had such a following that Macmillan put his name on the cover of his Emmas, which were reprinted and reissued in a variety of decorative covers. They're quite lovely. They're all illustrated by Hugh Thompson. Another beautiful cover. All of these editions fetch a pretty penny today on the rare books market, although in their time they were simply affordable, readable copies. We also see in the 1890s some covers that include not only decorative elements, but depictions of characters, such as this J.M. Dent cover. To my eye, there are so many frills and furbelows that Emma seems almost overshadowed. Here, too, visual language encourages us to understand Austen's world as feminine and decorative. As a sample of how a woman artist of the time approached Emma, the proposal scene as rendered by Christiana, Hammond. Emma is looking down demurely, as is appropriate to the caption. She could really say nothing. But the characters' close posture and their intertwined hands convey their intimacy. And I think they must have their arms around each other in the back, mustn't they, to have their shoulders that close together? Hammond has been very careful, as indeed was Hugh Thompson, about historic details of dress. Early 20th century covers dialed down the level of saccharine decorativeness. Emma looks positively modern in this 1934 cloth cover. And even the next two somewhat wallpapery covers can be interpreted as suggestive of the interiors in which the characters of the novel while away their time. Again, you'll have to take my word for it, these are truly covers of Emma. Later 20th century paperback covers are all over the map, visually speaking. Of course, this is true not just of Emma, but Emma is our focus today. I've singled out just a few that center on elements of fashion. The first set depict historically accurate costumes, often drawn from prints or illustrations of the period. This elegant lady for Virago's reprint. This highly accessorized one for vintage classics. And these equally well-kitted out ladies for a recent Japanese translation and a Spanish translation, respectively. Instead of an entire period image of a well-dressed woman, some covers, such as this one into the Catalan language, present a meditation on a single item of fashion, bonnets, hats. Some covers, like this recent Chinese one, riff on the decorative elements we're familiar with from a century earlier. I quite like this cover because the two Chinese characters that render Emma's name are so reminiscent of the riddle in Austen's novel, What Two Letters Express Perfection? M-A. I also appreciate that the golden red color scheme is a neat way of bridging the distance between Jane Austen's world and the conventions of Chinese decoration. So those are the relatively historically accurate covers. To delight us all in the final few moments, some entertainingly off-the-wall 20th century covers. And I've put my very favorite first because I'm moving chronologically. The 1956 Italian cover is one of our favorites at Goucher. We are tempted to burst out into Oklahoma every time we see it. This depressing Ophelia is also quite diverting. And a colleague to whom I recently showed this said, I know that's been on the cover of Tessa of D'Urbervilles too, to which it arguably pertains better. As is this indescribable lady created for a Swedish edition. I confess I quite enjoy it when illustrators get the time period entirely wrong. This cover from an Indian edition is much more Wharton than Austen. This Hungarian image also really off base. We academics speak sometimes of the long 19th century. Well, it's really long when Austen's 1810s novels are presented with costumes from the 1880s or 1890s. And of course, when we enter manga-influenced territory, all bets are off in terms of facial features, hair, and costume. Also, I have to say, the concept of the romance comic quite delights me. If we can return from the ridiculous, let me end with heartfelt words of appreciation for the cover created by Dadu Shin, who's a Brooklyn-based artist, for the new Penguin Classics edition, for which I prepared the introduction and supplementary apparatus. My editor at Penguin, who wanted to be here today but wasn't able to, Elda Rotor, let me know that she wanted to move away from the traditional oil portrait of a Regency lady Penguin Classics cover. And she asked me to supply Dadu Shin, who is known for his illustrations of present-day fashion, with images of period dress. I sent links to the 1810s periodical Ackerman's Repository, several volumes of which we have at Goucher. Ackerman's was the vogue of its day, with up-to-the-moment illustrations of fashion as well as images of furniture and carriages and more. I could not be more pleased with what Dadu Shin designed. I love the suggestion that all the colorful people of Emma exist, in a sense, within the mind of an individual woman. Emma, perhaps, the imaginist, as Austen famously calls her, or perhaps Austen as author herself. And I utterly adore the subtle but unmistakable way in which Shin suggests that we can all see ourselves in Austen's world, regardless of who we are and where we come from, even if we, like that lady in the very middle, have turquoise skin. I can see her a bit better. The slide is not doing justice to her, so please take a postcard before you leave. She's very turquoise on the postcard, or on the actual cover. My goal with this new edition was to help readers, all readers, connect with Jane Austen's novel. To my mind, this is a decidedly feminist project centered on accessibility and inclusion. And I think this appealing, modern-feeling cover is a great invitation to pick Emma up and give it a try. And that's all from me, and I'm very happy to take questions. I hope you have some. Thank you. So we all need to use mics because of the live streaming. I'm going to step away with this one.
Juliette, thank you very much, as always wonderful. I always heard that Alberta Burke relaxed in the bathtub while her husband read to her. Okay,
Yes,
no, I don't
you're
know.
right. I told that story too hastily. Okay, so the first editions were not in the bathtub, but they were near the bathtub. They were in the same room as the bathtub. So now we can one up Alberta Burke. We can take our iPads, if we choose, into the very bathtub. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Jerry.
Hi.
Hello.
I wondered if you could speculate when you talked about the Philadelphia heritage of where the copies came from and what their life was. Did they go back across the ocean and come back? How did this kind of flow, and how did they get back there?
So the Countess of Dalhousie, as far as we know, the first owner of Goucher's copy, was living in Canada at the time because her husband was first Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia and then Governor General of British North America. So we believe that she bought the North American copy because it was on her continent. But as I said, until I look at her personal papers, her diaries, her account books, oh, I'm so hopeful that there will be delightful discoveries in those. We're just guessing. Another avenue of further research for me is to look more in the publishing records of Matthew Carey's firm. They have already yielded information that we did not have previously, including that his print run for the Philadelphia Emma was 500 copies. That wasn't known. And we also now know the exact month of 1816 in which his edition appeared, which wasn't known, and it's December, almost a year to the day after the London edition. So one thing I want to do is to read more of the orders that Carey received from his bookseller partners and from individuals to see where those copies were going straight away, because so far we know very little about that. Carey.
So I just wanted to comment on, I have two comments. One is the question of, in case anybody's wondering, with Emma being published without copyright or violating copyright, U.S. copyright law did not come into place until Dickens. And it was Dickens who
because of
fought,
Dickens,
because
exactly.
of Dickens, he
Yes.
fought really hard
Yes, exactly.
to pursue anybody who was publishing his works in the U.S., and so that's the birth of U.S. copyright law.
Yeah.
Now my question becomes, tell us of your discovery of the two unbeknownst copies of Emma and how you found them.
Oh, I wish this was a more colorful story than it is. So I mentioned briefly the eminent Austen bibliographer David Gilson, whose copy is now at King's College Library, Cambridge. David Gilson died just last year, and he was in poor health for several years. I think he would be delighted to know that we are all interested in Carey's edition today. When David Gilson was preparing his monumental bibliography of Jane Austen, which was published in 1982, revised edition in 1997, Gilson did not have available to him WorldCat. WorldCat is not a perfect source at all, but it is better than not having WorldCat. So I went on WorldCat and searched for 1816 Philadelphia Carey and came up with a reasonable list of possible copies. And then I started to get in touch with the libraries to say, do you really have Matthew Carey's 1816 Philadelphia edition? And often the answer was, oh, no, whoops. We don't, we have the 1833 edition, or we have something else. But there were two answers that were, oh yeah, we have that. And those answers came from Dartmouth and from Winterthur. Dartmouth and Winterthur they're well-known institutions. They have known all these years that they had a first American edition of Austen's Emma, but no one ever, made that connection with them. So instead of 4 known copies, we now have 6. Are there more out there? There may. I mean, I showed you the scary slide of the damage to Dartmouth's copy. My guess is there probably are not a whole lot more copies out there just because they weren't built to last. They were so cheaply made. But it's possible that an individual or a family, or my guess, a historic house museum or small regional historical library that has not digitized its catalog, it's possible that there are copies out there. And my colleagues are now saying to me, oh, I'm pretty sure I know a collector who has one. And then they get back to me and say, oh, no, whoops, actually, it's a later one. But maybe. And we hope at Goucher that with our new digital edition and various forms of attention to the Carey edition, that the word will get out there and people will look. And so I would say every time you go to a little historic house museum, and they have books behind glass, peer at them and ask if they've been cataloged and help. Come up to the mic if you wouldn't mind.
Thank you for being here. And I just, I don't know if this is something you're interested in, but in terms of costumes, I was fortunate to work on Pride and Prejudice at A&E, and I thought the costumes were phenomenal. I think they got an Emmy for costumes. So I'm curious if you've seen the recent productions of Emma, and if you think in the novels, Jane Austen does a good idea of making it clear what she would have liked to seen in these particular productions today, and if they did a good job in terms of what Austen would have expected things to look like in the film. I mean, I know this, you might not, I'm just curious to hear a scholar's point of view on that.
We all have opinions about this. We're just waiting to be asked. I think that in film and television and screen versions of Austen, often the greatest concern for historical accuracy goes into the clothing. And that's true of TV production in general. It's true of Downton Abbey. It's true of these that you, the concern with historical accuracy, and also what reads on screen, what will convey messages about the characters to the audience are paramount. Jane Austen really tells us very little about what her characters are wearing. And of course, this is so obvious. When you're watching depictions of characters on stage or on screen, you have to look at something. For all those many hours, they have to be wearing something, and so someone needs to make the choices of color and cut and dress. I don't know enough about costume to be bothered by the decisions in the recent adaptations. What bothers me is often the huge disjunction that happens between the costume and the head, when you have modern day makeup and modern day ideas of beautiful hairstyles and often horrible hair coloring and then acting that, in an effort to reach a wide audience, often departs significantly from the decorum of Jane Austen's day. Shall we? Okay. Thanks so much.